But in Slovenia, the government, it's now more than 2 years, have not even started to talk about it.
If they do not change what they've done in Slovenia, who would want to invest in the country?
No, it's a serious issue, as I said, not only for Slovenian citizens, but overall for the Slovenian economy. So it must be addressed promptly and seriously by the Slovenian authorities.
Hi, I'm Stephanie, and I'm here today in beautiful Bled, Slovenia. And with me is Mr. Guillaume Prasch, who is the Managing Director of Better Finance, the European Federation of Investors and Financial Services Users. And we're here today to discuss what's going on in Slovenia. It's not in the international news at all, or perhaps just a little bit, and it really should be there. To give a little bit of background on this, on December 18, 2013, in one day, all 3 systemic banks in Slovenia wiped out all subordinated bondholders and shareholders. And when I say wipe out, I mean absolute wipeout. These investors, including retail investors, it could be your grandpa, your grandma, they got nothing for their investment. It was a total wipeout. And in addition to the retail investors, there were pension funds that were also wiped out. And pension funds include people who are saving for retirement. So this was a really particularly harsh bail-in, and it may be the worst in the EU. However, the international press has not covered this. And this is what I want to discuss today with Mr. Prasch.
I think first we need to specify that we are moving from a bailout environment for dealing with banks' crisis. So bailout means the help comes from the outside of the bank and usually from the states and from the taxpayers. And now we are moving into a supposedly better scheme, which is bail-in, where the money would come from insiders. The problem is, first, that this thing is applicable only since the beginning of this year, 2016, and in Slovenia it was so-called applied, bail-in was applied by the Slovenian government in late 2013, as you mentioned, for 3 important banks in Slovenia. And very strangely, they applied bail-in where it was not applicable. They said it was applicable because the European authorities would have asked for it. We'll come back to that, I'm sure, in your questions. And second, even though the situation of these banks didn't seem to warrant it, they wiped, as you said, completely out, not only institutional investors, pension funds, but retail investors themselves, where they were sold these bonds as a substitute to deposits at their counter in the banks.
So this is what's really interesting to me, that the retail investors got completely wiped out. They got nothing, and they went into the bank and they thought they were buying something that was equal to a deposit. To me, this is incredible that this has not received international attention.
Yeah, first it is quite exceptional. Better Finance is the European Federation of Investors and Financial Services Users, so we are covering all European countries, and this is quite unique, first thing. And second, as you said, it is quite shocking, I would say, that it has not received much international attention, especially from the European authorities and from the European media, because it's not an isolated case where banks are in trouble and where investors have to take a haircut. There was the Spanish case, there are cases in Italy, in Austria, in Portugal, in Belgium. Every time the authorities tried to make sure that the retail investors, at least, the ones who are the non-insider investors who know very little about the real status and the real financial strength of the banks, get protected and don't get totally wiped out when there is sufficient funding. That's not the case in Slovenia. I'm wondering if it's just benign neglect from European authorities because this is a small country, but we strongly believe EU citizens have to be treated equally, whether they are in a smaller member state or in a bigger member state. Or is it worse than that? Is it because it is a small member state that we can, crush all investors like this?
And the second idea is very worrying. But before we get into that, could you tell me a little bit about better finance and its role in protecting investors?
Certainly. Thank you, Stephanie. So this Better Finance, as I said, is the European Federation of Investors and Financial Services Users. We have member organizations, associations of small retail investors and financial consumers in all European countries, including in Slovenia. And Slovenia, our Slovenian member association, alerted us on this issue quite early. And usually, we would just follow up and relay in the European media. Mm-hmm. But this time, as we do really when we feel there is very likely to be a very serious case of retail investors' abuse, and that is apparently neglected by European authorities, then we would write. And that's what we decided to do on 8 February this year. The president of Better Finance wrote to the EU commissioners and to the Slovenian government.
And did you receive a response to this?
So we did receive a response from the 2 EU commissioners, the EU Commissioner for Finance, Lord Hill at that time, and the EU Commissioner for Competition, Mrs. Vertager. But we have not yet, it was in February, received any response from the Prime Minister and from the Minister of Finance of the government of Slovenia, which is quite unusual and quite surprising.
It makes you think they're trying to just push it under the carpet. So I hope
you said it.
Yeah, I said it, not you. So I hope that you follow up and we'll see what happens and if they respond or not. But on a second topic, there was a case filed in Slovenia in the Constitutional Court that actually was referred up to the Court of Justice of the EU. And from my reading of the opinion, and I think a reasoned reading of the opinion, it was a very, very favorable outcome for the retail investors. However, what was really interesting, perhaps troublesome, was that it was not reported this way by the press. I mean, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, that was quite surprising, to say the least. It's an understatement. In fact, this court case is totally related to this bail-in issue of the 3 Slovenian banks you mentioned, because at that time the directive on bail-in, the European directive on bail-in, was not even finalized, and this directive has been entered into force only on January 1, 2016. So. At least 2 years after. And when the Slovenian government nationalized these 3 banks and totally wiped out the retail investors, it said it's because of a request, a demand from the European Commission. So the Slovenian retail investors, including our member organization in Slovenia, went to court to say, look, there could not be such demand because the bail-in directive was not even finalized. It was just a recommendation from the Commission. And finally, as you mentioned, the European Court of Justice, a few days ago, in July, said that retail investors were right. It was not a mandatory request, and it could not be legally mandatory request from the European Commission. Strangely enough, as you mentioned, the release on this judgment from the European Commission, from the European Court of Justice, itself, seems to say to give reason to to the European Commission. So this is very disturbing because one can wonder whether it was just a mistake, a mishap, or was it done on purpose.
We hope it's just out of laziness that they didn't bother
we hope so too.
To read the entire opinion. But when an opinion the opinion itself stated that this EC banking communication was not legally binding. This is what you would think the press should and would pick up on, rather than how it actually occurred.
I fully agree. That was the question asked to the European Court of Justice, and the decision was on this. Unfortunately, it's press release, and of course the further media communications that were, based on this press release, unfortunately, most often missed that critical point.
Yeah, and then this goes back to the topic we discussed earlier. I mean, what is happening here? Is it because Slovenia is a small country that this is happening, or is there a bigger underlying plan in all this?
Again, it's quite disturbing.
Yeah.
We would not want, and we would be concerned if there was any intention from the European authorities. And when I'm talking about the European authorities, I'm not talking about the Court of Justice, but I'm talking about the European Commission and the European Central Bank on the other side, to just having flexed their muscles on a small member state like Slovenia to try to have some sort of pure case of bail-in, like they tried to do actually, and they did actually first with Cyprus, which is another small member state, where depositors were really hammered totally down by the Commission and the European Central Bank.
It is disturbing, and I guess the takeaway question from this is, do you think this 100% wipeout in Slovenia is just a deviation, or do you think that this might have a chance of occurring elsewhere within the EU?
That's a very good question. First, bail-in in principle is not wrong. Especially insider investors who have put money into a bank that is failing, they have taken some risks, and so they are also sometimes a say in the governance of the bank.
Yeah.
But when you are talking about retail investors who were sold bonds at the counter of the bank, or in the case of Cyprus, even depositors, this is going too far unless you have very strong protection measures for these non-insider small investors and depositors. And obviously this is not happening in Slovenia, because despite local investors, local consumers, and even better finance at the European level asking the Slovenian government to make a little effort for these people who have been clearly abused, nothing has been happening so far.
And this is what is disturbing. I mean, we really need to get to the point that these are retail investors. They've invested, some of them may have invested their life savings in something they thought was very safe, a bank in Slovenia, and then all of a sudden, poof, everything is gone.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. So it is a very disturbing and concerning case. We believe with this decision from the European Court of Justice, there is now a good chance that in Slovenia itself, the process will be improved, but we will also most probably at European level ask again the Slovenian government to come into action regarding the protection of its own retail investors and pension savers, because some pension funds were hit as well.
Right, and for people who don't understand, I mean, the pension funds are what individuals invest in to get retirement for. So it's also wiping out individual investors. And maybe we can talk a little bit about what a bail-in really is versus a bailout. I think we touched on it a little bit before, but the thing, I believe what is happening now is the governments don't necessarily want to contribute to failing banks. So what they're trying to do is get the investors. If you are investing in a failing bank, then they're taking your money from you basically and not giving any help. Is my understanding correct?
It is correct, but the principle of bail-in again, which as you said, opposed to bailout, it's not governments and taxpayers who are supposed to pay for the bank failure, but people who invested in the bank. This principle is not shocking in itself, it is not a concern in itself. If these investors have been properly informed and have had some influence on the management of the bank. But unfortunately, very often that is not the case. And of course, that is not, especially not the case for retail investors and a fortiori depositors who are supposed, to know sometimes even better than the banking supervisor what is the real financial situation of banks, which is totally absurd.
Well, it's just not fair to a retail investor
Exactly.
to have to do that degree of due diligence before they buy something that's recommended to them by somebody at the counter. I mean, it's simply not fair.
And there is an additional problem to this, is there enough transparency in the financial condition of these banks? In the case of Slovenia, again, the Slovenian government pretended end of 2013 that these banks were totally insolvent. That was their rationale for wiping out totally investors, both institutional investors and retail investors. But when there was an independent audit run by an audit firm, the capital ratios were much better than the ones that were produced by the Slovenian government to argue for a total wipeout. So citizens, European citizens as savers and as investors have the right to the full transparency, the full truth on the bank's real conditions, and this has to come from the bank supervisors and from the governments. And today we are questioning if this is really happening.
Exactly. And it's my understanding that here in Slovenia, they still have not been able to get the actual valuations that were used to wipe out these retail investors.
Yeah, these valuations keep to be produced and new figures being thrown out. So it remains quite a muddy area. Our Slovenian member organization even wrote to the European Central Bank to get clarification on what is called the stress test or the qualitative capital assessment of the Slovenian bank situation. And the responses they received were not very clear, because they pointed out again that the ratios were not the same coming from an independent auditor and coming from the Central Bank of Slovenia, and the response from the European Central Bank was not very clear, to be candid.
So it sounds to me like Better Finance has its work cut out for it.
Exactly, that's exactly what Better Finance has been set up for.
And then just to give a little bit of background on the difference for some people who may not be European, like me, I'm American. In America, we have class actions. We have this sort of fallback if something like this happens. But I think it's much more difficult here in Europe for these investors to actually achieve any sort of justice.
It is true that it is much more difficult in Europe. For the first reason you mentioned is that there is a lack of effective collective redress schemes in the EU for retail investors, except in the Netherlands, but that is not the case in Slovenia. And also there is much less transparency, as I pointed out before, from the public supervisors, the public banking supervisors. In the US, the public authority supervising banks is releasing every quarter on its website to all EU, in that case US citizens, the financial situations of all the American banks. In the EU, studies have been made, not by us, by independent think tanks as well, that show that this is very rare at the member state level, and it is also very rare at the European level. So it is a big issue, transparency as well in Europe.
It's a huge issue, and if there is no transparency, then cases like this can happen over and over again.
Yes, and how can you ask in a bail-in environment, how can you ask a retail investor to make a qualified opinion on whether he should put money in that bank, or in bank A or bank B, if he cannot even access the proper data?
Yeah. I mean, that is a point, but it's also a point that you have to trust your banks. There has to be some trust from a retail investor. I mean, to me, it's almost inconceivable that a retail investor should have to do all this homework before they can invest.
I fully agree with you, Stephanie. As we used to say for consumers and savers and retail investors, it is not a full-time job. These people are not professional financial people.
And from my understanding in Slovenia, the case is even worse here than what we're talking about. Because I believe after the bail-in of Slovenia, there was a banking amendment in which it wiped out the Slovenia's investors to even challenge this.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, there is a recent banking act that de facto prevented these people who have been wiped out to claim any damages or to go to court. So that is linked to this recent European Court of Justice decision. This European Court decision might enable Slovenians to get back some rights and some damages, in fact, in this case. But we are not yet there.
Well, I hope that Slovenia gets there, because from what I've been seeing internationally, Italy has managed to kind of circumnavigate the situation to indemnify to some degree the retail investors and its banks there, and other countries have also.
It's very good you point this out, because it is what is shocking with the Slovenian situation, is that in other cases, which in some instances were much worse, the banks were in much worse situations than these 3 Slovenian banks, in fact 6 in total that we are discussing, in Spain, for example, or in Italy, as you mentioned. And there, either through a court action like in Spain, or via the government action in Italy, retail investors have or are beginning to get some indemnification. But in Slovenia, the government, it's now more than 2 years, have not even started to talk about it.
And these poor people may be dead before they get any justice.
We hope not, but the Slovenian authorities should hurry up, because it's a very serious case. As you said, first it's a question of trust, not only of trust of the Slovenian people, but also of other investors outside of Slovenia to invest in Slovenia.
Well, this is the total broader. It's a really, if you broaden into that, if the banks, if Slovenia actually, if they do not change what they've done in Slovenia, who would want to invest in the country?
It's a serious issue, as I said, not only for Slovenian citizens, but overall for the Slovenian economy. So it must be addressed promptly and seriously by the Slovenian authorities.
Exactly, those, and also in a fair manner.
Exactly. I couldn't say it better. There should be no discrimination, and people, even the small savers and investors, should be treated fairly and equally.